Ladies, gentlemen, and Nephilim of all ages, Diablo 4's release is right around the corner, and oh, it's time to get excited. There are few games like a Diablo game, and even the ones that you could call similar have such vast differences that Diablo itself is always a big deal and a really fun experience. Before the game actually comes out, though, there is a beta happening for all players who have pre-purchased the game, and so today I thought it'd be fun to go over each of the classes available within this beta and the game itself to help you work out which one is right for you, which one to spend your limited beta time playing. Of course, for this, there is the matter of potential strength. You want to know if your class is going to do well in the end game if you plan on spending loads of time on them early on, but generally speaking, every class will at least do decently in endgame PvE. That's just the way that the game is designed, so your decision should more be based on what speaks to you, what gameplay style gels with you, and what you enjoy the aesthetic of course. So with that said, let's go over the 5 classes currently in Diablo 4, which are the Barbarian, the Sorcerer, the Rogue, the Druid, and the Necromancer. As for the Barbarian, this one is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. You won't be bothering with magic in any real way, just lugging around loads of various melee weapons to slap, slam, and slice your enemies to bits. You'll have skills that let you leap around or charge to let you close the gap and remove some of your range disadvantage over other classes, but as far as actual combat goes, your main goal will be getting right up in the enemy's face and punishing them for daring to stand anywhere near you. You will have a few skills that can do damage at range, but that isn't really your goal when you're playing this class. As a result of this position, the Barbarian is pretty much the most offensive class in the game as well. They expect you to be right up in front where the damage is coming, and so rather than avoiding attacks, they let you go full beef and tank as much as you can while still having it be somewhat fair. One of the ways that the Barbarian achieves its class identity in this game is called the Arsenal system. This lets you wield 4 weapons at the same time, not literally like holding them out in front of you together, but more so you have 4 weapons equipped from a variety of choices, and you tie each of your active skills to a specific weapon. This means when you use a skill, it will be done with that chosen weapon when you use it, and if you use a different skill, it will be done with that other weapon that you've tied that skill to. This can make for some really cool looking combat where you're swapping back and forth between all 4 different weapons if you want to, like a flurry of metal scraping on your foes. There are 7 different weapons that the Barbarian can access, and you can equip 4 of them at any given time, which means the variety isn't massive, but it can definitely make for some fun situational changes. Past that, a couple more things to note about the Barbarian. Their move speed is one of the best in the game. Aside from the various movement skills that I mentioned earlier, the Barbarian also has a buff that gives them an extra 30% move speed pretty much permanently, and also various ways to just boost their own movement speed through further active and passive skills you'll pick up along the way, meaning that you'll just feel fast as hell moving around the place. As far as damage, the Barbarian does a ridiculous amount of focus damage in bursts. Your core skills absolutely melt enemies, but to even get to those, you do have to build it up by attacking them with your basic skills. They cost a lot of resources, and compared to the other classes, your resource regeneration is a little bit slower. So it's good to think of the Barbarian as a sort of bursty melee-focused tank with high movement and a full-on arsenal of weapons for slaughtering with. Second up then, let's talk Sorcerer. This one is all about absolutely massive screen-encompassing visual effects across 3 different elements: lightning, fire, and cold. Each of these elements are strong and viable focuses, but each of them has a sort of different feeling and overall effect on the battlefield, so more than likely you'll be mixing and matching little bits of each so you have access to each of their specialties when you need them. Lightning elemental spells tend to focus on things like melee range attacks and massive AoEs that span your entire screen, which makes them great for clearing smaller enemies. Fire spells are generally going to hit your highest damage, be big and explosive, and they also have tons of secondary effects on with percentage chances to proc. Then cold, as you might guess, is heavily crowd control focused, lots of slows, lots of stuns, and this can be incredible in various situations where you'd otherwise feel a little bit cornered. The Sorcerer also has a mechanic called Lucky Hit, which gives you a bonus chance of proccing any special effects on your weapon or even your skills, simply making the Sorcerer better at applying these secondary effects than any other class, which is a really neat way to give the Sorcerer a sort of secondary focus. As far as defensives, the Sorcerer is definitely squishier than the Barbarian, as can be expected, obviously, but they do still have some decent defensive options as well, such as a shield and also some passive damage reduction after you cast a spell. So as long as you are continuously casting various spells, you'll just take less damage from attacks. While the majority of your spells will require you to stand on the spot, which can be dangerous, you do also have a few options for casting while moving that are still quite potent damage, so you aren't locked into just standing there and taking the damage that comes into into you. You can kite enemies around and still deal loads of damage yourself. From what I've heard of those in the closed betas, the biggest weaknesses that the Sorcerer has is simply low team play. The other classes just have more ways to buff their party, whereas the Sorcerer is much more focused on their own personal power. The Sorcerer also, of course, has a teleport ability. It does what it sounds like, it is extremely strong, and it not only deals damage, but it also buffs your damage for a bit after using it, and you can modify it to reduce the cooldowns of your other abilities as well, which is just nuts. Essentially, the Sorcerer is your big classic fantasy wizard. Tons of elemental spells, massive damage, massive areas of effect, tons of special effect crowd control, and if you like wizards, you like wizards. There's not really much else to it. Thirdly then, let's talk about the Rogue. This is a class with a heavy mix of ranged and melee options, as well as loads of traps. This class has arguably the highest mobility in the entire game, but also arguably the worst defensive options. So as far as that goes, if you like a more skill-based system where you need to actively avoid damage instead of just powering through it, this one probably fits your playstyle a bit more than the others. Conversely, if your internet isn't great or your system doesn't let you play the game with a decent frame rate, you will probably struggle more with Rogue than the other options. As far as its mix of damage, the ranged options are just a bit stronger than the melee options, considering that you'll have access to bows, and bows have abilities that generally make them do more damage the further away you are, and tie that in with your mobility so you can do a lot of damage with a bow. You'll probably spend a bit more time further away than the enemies as a result. And considering that you have to actively dodge attacks from enemies a bit more than the other classes, that does work to your advantage anyways. The Rogue is generally considered one of the strongest early game classes due to its strong basic skills, and so if your goal in the beta is just to experience as much of it as you can in the time period, this may be a good choice for that reason as well. The Rogue also has the ability to imbue their attacks with few different elements to let you actively change up what you're doing constantly. It can imbue attacks with cold for loads of CC, poison which is great single target damage, or shadow to add AoE attacks to their attacks and hit big pockets of enemies at the same time. As far as the traps the Rogue has, these are a cool secondary focus of the class, but they aren't really built to be used offensively so much as defensively. Again, you are arguably the squishiest class, so these traps are more meant to stop waves of smaller enemies from closing the gap on you than anything else. The Rogue also has a stealth mechanic, but this can be a little bit rough, as obviously there are loads of AoE attacks from enemies in the game, and stealth does not help with that at all. Not to mention that the stealth mechanic is generally more tailored towards the melee side of the Rogue, which once again is just a bit weaker than the ranged side of their damage anyways. Generally speaking, if you like the idea of being both melee and ranged, if you like bows and daggers and traps and stealth as concepts, the Rogue will fit that role excellently. The skill requirement to avoid death is a bit higher than the other classes, but that can also add a fun element to the gameplay if you enjoy playing that way anyways, and honestly, in higher difficulty, more endgame content, most people will be wanting to dodge rather than tank anyways, so you sort of just get an advantage by having all the extra mobility options as a result. Then for the final two classes, we have a bit less information on their actual strengths and deeper gameplay mechanics, as they weren't available in previous betas or press testing that isn't under NDA, but we can still go over the general expectations as well as their class identities. For the Druid, you can summon wolf companions, but you can also transform your character itself into one of two transformations, one being a giant bear, which is big and tanky, and the other being a werewolf, which is far more damage focused with quick attacks. These transformations are instant, but both of them have limited durations, so you cannot just stay in bear form forever, sadly. The Druid also has access to two types of magic, being earth and storm spells, and the extra special thing is that some of the Druid spells actually deal health percentage damage, meaning quite simply, the bigger your enemy is, the more health they have, the more damage they will take from these spells. And while this won't be overly helpful early on in the game, in endgame content this should be extremely powerful. As well, they seem to have an interesting unique system where you can make offerings to spirit animals that you find, and in return you will get a massive passive effect, and you can hold up to 6 of these at a time. Everything from this point forward is a bit speculation based on how Druids have been in previous Diablo games and from what we have seen so far. An expected weakness for Druids is simply mobility. They are pretty much a melee focused class, even as a bit of a spellcaster, but they won't have access to all of the constant leaps and charges of the Barbarian. Offensively, they have a lot of potential variety. The life percentage spells are a big deal, of course, but then they also have the wolf companions that deal damage for you, and then you can deal a fair bit of physical damage yourself too with your animal forms. Not only that, but you should be able to focus each of these specializations sort of separately, being more magic focused, being more companion focused, and you'll likely be able to focus one of your 2 transformations rather than just being strong at both. Druid is one that I'm personally a really big fan of, and I might well be the one that I play myself if the mobility isn't overly crippling. At the end of the day, if you like having animal companions and being able to transform into bears and werewolves, then this is probably the class for you. The health percentage damage is a big bonus, but I am generally of the mind that you should pick the class that you like the feel and concept of more than anything else. Then finally today we have the Necromancer, and this is my personal second consideration of what I want to play, but again we have somewhat limited information on them. As far as what we do know, this is going to be your dark magic wielder, and they will have a surprisingly large amount of choices for what they use. They'll be able to summon friends to help in combat, and they can actually interact with corpses that you create in combat as well. Generally speaking, there are 4 playstyles that we are aware of. One is just a straight up army type playstyle focused around generating loads of summons and just throwing them at your enemies. One is bone, which is far more physical damage coming from the Necromancer themselves, as you might expect. One is darkness, which is loads of damage over time type shenanigans. And then finally is blood. This will be their sort of tankiness option, as blood is straight up lifesteal, giving you health in proportion to the damage that it does to enemies. Their unique mechanic is called the Book of the Dead, which lets you customize the types of summons that you'll have. Generally, there are 2 types of summons, skeleton warriors and skeleton mages. Skeleton warriors can be customized to either be more damage focused or more tankiness focused, drawing away damage from you and your other summons. These skeleton mages can be customized to have varying types of damage or effects depending on your choices. As well, you can sacrifice various summons in order to buff yourself as the Necromancer. We don't exactly know what this means specifically, as it was a bit vague, but as far as a class concept, it sounds really cool. So generally speaking, if you like the sound of a class based around dark magic that summons corpses from the battlefield to fight for you, uses a variety of bone, blood, and darkness magic, as well as having superior control of your summons and the largest sheer amount of summons, this is a pretty cool class for you. And that's just about it, everyone. The most concisely I could explain which classes that you should have a go at in the Diablo 4 beta, and as we move forward into the full game itself, of course. I personally think that class choice is more about the concept than anything. You should go for what sounds cool to you, but for those of you who wanted a better idea of the gameplay mechanics themselves, I did try to describe those in the best detail that we currently have as well. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to experience the beta with you all in a few days' time. Like if you liked the video, subscribe, hit the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.